Good morning or good afternoon. We're delighted that you have joined us today for our continuing series about the amendments to the Constitution. This is a project that the Society took on nearly a year ago, maybe more than a year ago, to go through each amendment to the Constitution of the United States, looking at what was going on at the time it was passed, what was the debate, how did it get passed, and what has it meant since it's been passed as we've moved forward. We welcome you to the United States Capitol Historical Society, which is the nonprofit, nonpartisan, entity chartered by Congress. We're chartered by Congress. We're not funded by Congress. We're funded by the generous support of our members, friends, and supporters, and many of you are on today. Thank you so very much. And our task, as is included and outlined in our authorizing legislation, is to tell the story of the Capitol and the people who work in the Capitol in a manner that inspires informed patriotism. We believe that informed patriotism includes understanding our history. And every time the Constitution was amended, it involved the United States Congress. Today, we are honored to have Katherine Scott from the United States Historical Office lead our webinar on the 17th Amendment and its critical role in transforming American democracy and governance. This amendment was ratified on April 8th, 1913, and represented a significant shift from the framers' original version of a legislature-selected Senate to a Senate directly elected by the people of each state. The direct election of senators changed the way our political system operated, and the theory was to make the Senate more responsive, representative, less susceptible to legislative stalemates, corruption, and special interests. Remember what was going on at the time. The 17th Amendment not only made the Senate more democratic in the small d democratic, but reflects the Constitution's dynamic nature. Our Constitution survived now almost 250 years because it was possible to amend it when the people felt in an overwhelming manner that the amendment was appropriate. Dr. Katherine Scott will detail the amendment's journey, its immediate and enduring effects on American electoral politics, and its role in reshaping the dynamics between state and federal powers. So at this point, I want to present to you our featured guest, Dr. Katherine Scott. You can turn your camera on. The United States Senate historian. She joined the Senate Historical Office in 2010 after receiving her PhD in American Political History from Temple University. Dr. Scott conducts research, writes content, and develops customized talks and tours for senators, staff, and special Senate guests. She is currently editing the executive sessions of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, 1969 to 1975, and conducting oral histories with long-serving Senate staff to document the changes that have occurred in the institution over time. She is the author of Reigning in the Senate, Civil Society and Congress in the Vietnam and Watergate eras, as well as articles, essays, and chapters related to U.S. political history. As Senator Scott talks, if you have questions that come to mind, please feel free to put them in the Q&A section. Those are the two speech bubbles that appear on your screen. If you're having difficulty connecting, you can't hear, you can't see, use the chat bubble, because Vincent Scott, our fabulous collaborator who has designed this series and does all the behind the scenes work, will be able to help figure out how to make that work for you. That being said, Dr. Scott, tell us about the 17th Amendment. Thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you so much, Jane. I appreciate the invitation. I'm delighted to be here with you today to speak about the Senate and the 17th Amendment. This is a story. This story is a long and winding road that takes us to the ratification of the 17th Amendment, providing for the direct election of U.S. senators. It's also a complex and colorful story that includes fisticuffs, allegations of corruption, a so-called race rider, and a splashy investigative expose that may have wandered a bit from the truth. It's also a story about a powerful reform movement and its long journey to success. Today, I present to you the fascinating account of the road to the 17th in 3 parts. Part 1, good intentions. When the 55 delegates to the Constitutional Convention met in Philadelphia in 1787, they agreed on a bicameral legislature, 1 House and 1 Senate. But how would members of each of these bodies be elected? Delegate James Wilson suggested that senators be selected by the people. But Elbridge Gerry and others immediately voiced their strong opposition to this proposal. The evils we experience flow from an excess of democracy. The people do not lack virtue, but are the dupes of pretended patriots, Gerry explained. Wilson's idea was soon discarded. Others proposed to have senators selected by members of the House itself, but that plan too was soon abandoned. Instead, delegates settled on a process whereby senators would be selected by state legislatures. Now, there were 2 advantages to this proposal in 1787. First, it had the benefit of being a familiar and comfortable system for those assembled at the convention in Philadelphia. Under the Articles of Confederation, their own state legislatures had selected them to serve as delegates to this historic meeting. State legislatures had also selected members to serve in the Continental Congresses. The second advantage to this proposal was both philosophical and structural. With each state having an equal vote in the Senate, observed James Madison, the body was designed to serve as the constitutional recognition of the portion of sovereignty remaining in the individual states. By placing the election of U.S. senators in state legislatures, the Constitution would insulate the Senate from the passions of the people and cement the connections between the states and this new federal government. You might even think of them, as they did at the time, as ambassadors for those states. Now, as ratified, the Constitution included Article 1, Section 3, which read, "The Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, chosen by the legislature thereof, for 6 years. Subsequent generations of citizens and lawmakers would be tasked with working out the details of those 23 words." Early debates during the first years under the new government reveal the tensions between state legislatures and the senators they sent to represent them in this new federal government. To whom did U.S. senators owe their primary allegiance? That was one of the questions that lawmakers asked. How literally would the concept of an ambassador for a state be taken? Well, that depended on which state you came from. North Carolina state lawmakers, for example, tried to keep their senators on a very tight leash. Samuel Johnston and Benjamin Hawkins arrived at Federal Hall in New York City with very detailed instructions about how to represent North Carolina's interests in this new federal system. In fact, the state legislature had required the attendance of Johnston and Hawkins when the state legislature was in session. But in New York, Johnston and Hawkins disregarded those instructions. While the majority of the legislature considered senators primarily the agents of the individual states, Johnston and Hawkins considered themselves agents of this union. One of them implored Alexander Hamilton, if the states have a right to instruct us, these new senators, why are we bound by oath to support the Constitution? So at least initially, indirect election, as prescribed by the Constitution, required some negotiation between state legislatures and the individuals they sent to the United States Senate. Part 2, deadlock, bribery, corruption. In addition to concerns about the primary allegiance of senators, indirect election posed another challenge almost immediately. Partisan disagreements among state lawmakers delayed the appointment of senators. The first of these cases occurred in 1789 as the new government was just getting started. Disagreements among New York lawmakers delayed the election of the state's first 2 senators for several months that year. And it wasn't long before some people began to question the wisdom of indirect election and propose changes to this system. The first proposal to amend the Constitution to provide for direct election of senators was introduced in the House of Representatives in 1826. It was introduced another 5 times between the years 1850 and 1855, but the proposal never made it out of a House committee. Andrew Johnson of Tennessee was a proponent of direct election while he served in the House, while he served in the Senate, and later when he served as vice president. Post-Civil War partisan squabbles further kindled the then nascent movement for this reform. Fierce partisan battles erupted between Democrats and Republicans in Congress and at the state level. Within state legislatures, these partisan disagreements often played out in the election of U.S. senators. One of these cases, the election of New Jersey Democrat John Stockton in 1865, prompted the first change to the system of direct election. When Stockton arrived at the Senate to present his credentials on December 4, 1865, he also carried a memorial, a petition, from some members of the New Jersey legislature. They charged that Stockton's election was invalid because he had been elected by a plurality rather than a majority of the votes in the joint session. Speaking in his own defense before senators, Stockton presented a detailed list of the procedures used by state legislatures across the country in electing their U.S. senators. Senators are not always elected in New Jersey or in any other state, I presume, in precisely the same way, Stockton insisted. And the Senate declared while the Senate declared Stockton's seat vacant, they also acknowledged Stockton's point. New Jersey lawmakers elected him again, and he did come back to the Senate and serve from 1869 to 1875. But in response to the evidence presented in his case, Congress in July of 1866 passed a law to regulate the time and procedure for the election of U.S. senators. This legislation represented the first major change in the selection process originally authorized by the Constitution's framers. But the law did not end partisan deadlocks. To the contrary, they became ever more frequent. The House approved amendment resolutions to provide for direct Senate elections in 1893, 1894, 1898, 1900, and 1902. The Senate refused to consider any of these proposals, despite the fact that partisan battles regularly deadlocked state governments, resulting in Senate vacancies that lasted for months and even years. Between the years 1891 and 1905, 45 deadlocks occurred in 20 different states. Deadlocks at times delayed the election of a senator for months and then years. Take the case of Delaware. In 1899, during a joint session of the state legislature, 113 votes were taken over 64 days and produced no winner, leaving that seat vacant in the Senate for the next 4 years. Now consider the case of Missouri. I promised you fisticuffs in my introduction, and now I'll deliver. When the Missouri State Legislature met in 1905 to elect a U.S. senator, partisan battles among lawmakers soon devolved into bedlam. Historian George Haynes described the dramatic scene this way. Lest the hour of adjournment should come before an election was secured, an attempt was made to stop the clock upon the wall of the chamber. Democrats tried to prevent it being tampered with, and when certain Republicans brought forward a ladder, it was seized and thrown out the window. A fistfight followed. Desks were torn from the floor. The glass of the clock front was broken. but the pendulum still persisted in swinging until, in the midst of a yelling mob, one member began throwing ink bottles at the clock and finally succeeded in breaking the pendulum. Now, Delaware and Missouri were only two of the most dramatic cases, but there were many others. And the frequency of the deadlocks and the eruption of violent political events furthered national calls for reform. The Democratic Party endorsed direct election in their party platform in 1900, 1904, 1908, and 1912. In the Western states, the direct election movement was particularly popular and supported by farmers' associations, granges, and other civic associations. In 1906, those who supported direct election got a major boost from an investigative expose titled Treason of the Senate. This 9-part series, published in Cosmopolitan magazine, alleged that large corporations and unethical state legislators were corrupting the process of electing U.S. senators. Though critics accuse the author of sensationalizing his stories, Treason of the Senate was a wildly popular series that doubled Cosmopolitan's circulation within 2 months of its publication. The calls for election reform were coming from all corners, but the Senate wouldn't budge on the issue. The reform movement, however, was unrelenting, and allegations of bribery and corruption in Senate elections came to the Senate's doorstep. In 1907, the Wisconsin state legislature elected Isaac Stevenson, a successful Wisconsin businessman, to fill a vacant seat. Stevenson won election to a full term in 1909. But 2 years later, the Wisconsin legislature notified the U.S. Senate that it considered the election results to be invalid. A state investigation had found evidence of bribery and corruption by Stevenson, both in the state's direct primary in 1908 and in his 1909 election by legislature. A separate Senate investigation found ample evidence of lavish spending and inadequate record-keeping of campaign finances. A separate report issued by a minority of U.S. senators concluded that Stevenson's election was invalid. Though Stevenson retained his Senate seat, the case garnered nationwide attention. And Stevenson's Senate election was not the only one tainted by such allegations at this point in time. William Lorimer presented his Senate credentials in 1909 in the U.S. Senate, but the following year, following widespread allegations of corruption and bribery in his selection, the Senate launched an investigation into his campaign. Eventually, after a second Senate inquiry concluded that the votes cast for Lorimer had been corruptly obtained, the Senate voted to unseat him in 1912. Deadlock, bribery, and corruption. What were the states to do about this problem? Now, ironically, by the early 20th century, the most persistent calls for reform came from state legislatures. States passed resolutions calling for direct election of senators. Frustrated and impatient in their attempts for federal reform, reformers pioneered new methods of electing senators at the state level. The Oregon Plan became the principal model, whereby voters could express their preference for senators in primary elections. Although the results of such primaries were not legally binding, in practice, state legislators were inclined to follow the popular mandate when they formally elected a U.S. senator. Following Oregon's lead, other states soon adopted similar methods of electing senators. By 1908, 27 state legislatures had formally petitioned Congress calling for the direct election of U.S. senators. By 1911, that number had grown to 37. The year 1911 marks a turning point in our long and winding road to direct election, leading us to part 3, the road to reform. 5 times the House had passed an amendment to the Constitution by the required 2/3 votes, providing for the direct election of senators. Each time those proposals had been sent to the Senate, where they where they were referred to the Committee on Privileges and Elections, and there the proposals had died. That was the case until 1911, when Republican Senator Joseph Bristow of Kansas made direct election his personal crusade. In January of 1911, Bristow proposed a constitutional amendment to modify Article 1, Section 3, and provide for direct election. A former newspaper editor, Bristow had joined the progressive wing of the Republican Party in the early 20th century. He had supported his state's adoption of a statewide senatorial primary. Kansas had adopted that primary system in 1908, and Bristow was the first Kansas senator elected under that new system. Upon entering the Senate, he allied himself with a group of Republican insurgents who favored expanding popular government, including amending the Constitution to provide for direct election. We must place more responsibility on the average citizen, Bristow insisted. After submitting his resolution in the Senate, Bristow worked closely with William Borah of Idaho. They maneuvered the proposal into a special subcommittee, which Borah chaired. Southern Democrats on that subcommittee tacked onto the proposal a so-called race rider, which stripped away the federal authority provided under Article 1, Section 4 that controlled the time and manner of federal elections. By removing Section 4, the Southern Democrats believed they could maintain methods at the state level for denying African Americans the right to vote in elections. This amendment prevailed in committee and was included with the resolution when it came to the Senate floor. When the Senate began to debate Bristow's proposal, now with the race rider attached, the debate took a surprising turn. Utah Senator George Sutherland offered an amendment to remove the race rider and take the language back to Bristow's original resolution. Opposing the move, Southern Democrats united with some conservative New England Republicans who opposed the issue, who hoped that the issue, the race rider, would doom the resolution. Disagreements among senators over Bristow's amended bill turned into a heated debate that lasted for months. Now, rather than centering on the issue of direct election of senators, the debate turned on whether or not the federal government, Congress, should have the authority to regulate federal elections. Though the Sutherland Amendment passed the Senate, it failed to receive the necessary two-thirds vote required for a constitutional amendment to move forward to ratification. In the next Congress, the House passed the resolution presented by Bristow with that race rider intact. In the Senate, the Bristow Amendment, a substitute in the next Congress and in the Senate, the Bristow Amendment was introduced without the race rider, thereby maintaining Article 1, Section 4, which provided Congress with the authority to regulate elections. Again, after much heated debate, the Senate approved the measure. Now the House and Senate had to meet to reconcile their different bills. Debate in the conference committee dragged on for nearly a year, I think, before the House eventually conceded to the Senate version of the bill, which left the federal election authority intact. Finally, in 1912, the Senate approved the 17th Amendment to the Constitution with a bipartisan vote of 64 to 24. Southern Democrats and Northeastern Republicans made up the bulk of the 24 opposing votes. The 17th Amendment went to the states for ratification, and on April 8, 1913, Connecticut provided the final vote necessary for its ratification. Now, Augustus Bacon of Georgia was the first senator to be popularly elected under the provisions of the 17th. First elected by state legislature in 1900, he had been reelected under that old system. When the amendment was ratified in the spring of 1913, the Georgia state legislature was not in session, and Bacon was serving under temporary appointment. He chose to run in a special election that year, which he won on July 15, 1913. What changes did the 17th Amendment bring to our national government, to our elections process, to our party system? Well, it might interest you and maybe surprise a few of you that the immediate electoral impact was perhaps unexpected. In the election of 1914, the first federal election to fall after the ratification of the amendment, voters overwhelmingly favored incumbent senators, those senators who had been elected by state legislatures in the previous system, re-electing 14 of the 16 who stood for re-election that year. Now, researchers, political scientists in particular, have shown that direct election affected party balance in the Senate in the decades since. While Republicans had claimed a Senate majority from 1881 to 1933 for all but 8 years, after direct election, after the ratification of the 17th Amendment, the partisan advantage went to the Democratic Party for a time. Democrats controlled the Senate from 1933 all the way up to 1981 for all but 4 years. How did direct election change campaigning? Well, research shows that faced with the prospect of appealing to a broader statewide constituency, incumbents modified their behavior. They became less partisan. They were more centrist in their campaigning. And particularly, they modified their voting behavior in the years before they faced re-election. The 17th did, of course, alter the relationship between states and the federal government. It also enhanced the power of individual voters. The ratification of the 17th Amendment represents the most substantive change to the Constitution as originally envisioned by its framers. But election by state legislatures ultimately proved vulnerable to corruption and encouraged political deadlock, and therefore required reform. I think that's one of the reasons that I love the story of the 17th. It really does reflect the genius of our government, structured as it is by a document that can be altered, albeit not easily, to reflect the needs and desires of the nation's citizens. Thank you for your attention, and I welcome your questions in the discussion.
What a great story. I know it's history is in fact a great story. Katherine, you've given me permission to call you Katherine. We could probably stop the share so that people can see your face as they put in their questions and answers. Can you tell our listeners a little bit more about the Senate historical offices? What is, we know you are an expert, so we can call on you for things about this, but what is your day-to-day life like?
Well, the Senate Historical Office was created in 1975, shortly after Watergate, the Senate Watergate investigation, in which a lot of interesting questions came up about the Senate's constitutional prerogatives. And the Senate leaders at the time, Mike Mansfield of Montana and Hugh Scott of Pennsylvania, thought that the historical office could serve a really significant purpose for the institution. It could serve as the place where the history of this place would be preserved and promoted to the Senate community and to people beyond. So people outside of the Senate would also better understand this place. We have a public-facing mission. We serve the senators and we serve their staff here, but also, of course, we serve the greater public. We are here to answer any types of questions that people may have about the history of this complex and fascinating place. On the historical office staff, there are 12 of us. There are historians, there are researchers and writers and publications editors. We also have a staff of archivists who help to preserve Senate records for future generations to tell these stories that, like I've been telling today. So that's in a nutshell the sort of work that we do. Now, on a daily basis, my job is just never quite the same. Every day is a little bit different, which is what makes this place which is what makes this position so much fun to be in. I've been here 14 years and I've never been bored. There's always something new going on, and there's always an interesting story to dive into and a character to sort of resurrect. There are so many senators who are frankly forgotten figures, but who changed the shape of our national story. So I might be preparing to for an oral history interview one day and delivering a talk to folks like you or to the senators or staff the next. Today, this afternoon, I'll be giving a tour to some senator staff of sort of off the beaten path spaces in the Capitol, probably places that these staff walk by or walk through every single day, but don't know the story behind the things that they're looking at. It's a great place to work. It's a really exciting job, and my colleagues are fantastic. So it's a lot of fun to be here.
Well, that's great. I know from my time in the Senate when I was Mary Lander's chief of staff, we ended up, when she left, relying on your office to guide how we archived all of, she was 18 years in the Senate, so you can imagine the amount of stuff that was there.
Yep.
But let's talk back about the 17th Amendment, which is really what people came to this conversation today to talk about. One of the things that, there's sort of the mythology and the reality. One of the things that sort of is part of the mythology of this is that during the old system, when the legislatures appointed the senators, senators didn't feel badly about resigning. They would serve, they would resign, the legislature would put somebody else in. Was resignation more often? And now, how does the Senate, describe for people the process of replacing a senator?
Well, the process is, would you like me to describe the process today or the process in the past?
First in the past, and how it's different today.
Okay, well, the Constitution provides originally designed, provided two ways to elect a United States senator, one by appointment, and the second, in the case of a vacancy, and the second by election, as we see in Article 1, Section 3, by election by legislature. Now, one of the things that one of the interesting pieces of scholarship that I've recently reviewed in preparation for this talk is scholarship which suggests that in that earlier period, in the pre-17th Amendment period, senators were less likely to serve long Senate terms. And that was in part because state legislatures had a more brisk turnover. And so the senators may not assume that they would be reelected because every few years, new state legislators may choose to go with someone else. So there was a less inclination for incumbency prior to the 17th Amendment. After the 17th Amendment, we see a bit more, I would say, stability with incumbency. The incumbents clearly have a significant advantage with their own constituencies in their home states. In terms of how providing for the election of senators post 17th, we've got the direct election, but of course we still have that appointment by governors in the case of a vacancy.
So question is, when the debate was on about the 17th Amendment, you referred a little bit to the partisan balance and how that shifted. We think about where the parties were standing today. How were the parties different in 1913 than they are today, or 1913?
Well, on this particular issue, or even more broadly, the issue of expanding the right to vote, right? Because we have two popular movements in the early 20th century for expanding the franchise, if that's the way we want to call it. We've got a really strong and vibrant movement to provide for a constitutional amendment to provide women with the right to vote. And we have this expansion of the franchise to provide for the direct election of US senators. So it's globally, we have within this broader sort of progressive label, We have members of the Democratic and Republican Party who consider themselves progressives on these issues on the particular issue of expanding the electorate. Now, where we see opposition within those two political parties tends to be a little regionally focused. So we have opposition among Northeastern Republicans and opposition among Southern Democrats, as I explained in my talk. We have among the Westerners, we have a much more sort of populist and progressive flavor of senators. Some of them Republicans, some of them Democrats. Again, it's a bipartisan issue, particularly out west, to expand the franchise, to provide women with the right to vote, and to ensure the popular election of United States senators. So I would say that today we tend to think of our two parties as relatively ideologically cohesive, where we have maybe conservatives tend to be in the Republican Party and, quote, liberals are Democrats. But in the period that right before the 17th Amendment, the parties are far less ideologically cohesive. You can have conservatives and liberals and progressives in Republican Party, and the same with the Democratic Party. Interestingly, though, in terms of where this breaks down among the parties, you do have the Democrats adding to their plank the 17th Amendment, the call for direct election of U.S. senators for 4 consecutive cycles, while the Republican Party does not add it to their plank, but members of the Republican Party and prominent members of the Republican Party, like William Howard Taft, come out publicly to favor it, but say that it really should be something that's left to the states to decide.
And to talk a little bit more about that whole discussion about the race rider.
Well, it's a very complicated story, isn't it?
Well, that's why we have questions.
Yes, absolutely. So the race rider is an amendment that's tacked on to Bristow's original proposal in 1911, as submitted. So Bristow submits the proposal in 1911. It goes to this special subcommittee created just for this purpose within the Committee on Privileges and Elections. And William Borah is the chairman of this special subcommittee. He favors direct election. But in the debate among subcommittee members, which includes some Democratic Southerners, they add the race rider. The race rider being this effort to amend not only Article 1, Section 3 to provide for direct election, but also amend Article 1, Section 4, which had enabled Congress to determine, to pass election, which had enabled Congress to set terms for federal elections. The amendment, the race rider amendment, is specifically targeted at removing the ability of Congress to interfere in elections, thereby eliminating basically Article 1, Section 4, or that part of Article 1, Section 4. And it's that now amended proposal that goes to the Senate floor with the race rider attached. So what happens once the bill is amended with the race rider, as I mentioned in my talk, is that the debate over the bill becomes less about direct election of senators and becomes focused almost solely, if you read the congressional record in this about these debates, you'll find that what they're focused on almost exclusively is this issue related to Article 1, Section 4, the race rider. And so in the Senate, the struggle becomes not so much the piece about the direct election of U.S. senators. It becomes a debate about America's racial dilemma. If we allow the race rider to remain on the bill, what will we be enabling Southern states to do in terms of shaping their elections to prevent segments of the population, African Americans in particular, from engaging in the process of elections?
And how did the African American community weigh in on that matter?
Well, that's an interesting question. And I'm not sure that I have seen evidence of it in the congressional record. Where I might see evidence of petitions, for example, to the Senate about elections and election challenges and corrupt elections, I don't know that in the course of that long debate, that particular issue comes up. But I'd have to check, Jane. That's a great question.
It'd be interesting. It's one of the things our folks are asking. Now, you said in 1866 was the first time there was a change in the legislature engaged, engaged the voters. Was there, how did that work? And were any of the senators from the former Confederacy involved in that?
Well, in 1866, we do not yet have the states that were members of the Confederacy. They have not yet returned to the Union and been accepted for congressional representation. In terms of that particular change, I just want to go back to my notes. What the change is related to is something very specific, which the change in 1866 is an effort for the Congress to address this problem of inconsistencies among the state legislatures and the way that they're holding elections and the way that they set the bar for how senators are elected by state legislatures. So in the case of Stockton, he's this fascinating character because he comes to the Senate with all of this research. He's compiled all of this research about how different states are electing their US senators. And he says, look, my research tells me that states have wildly different approaches to doing this. They don't hold their elections at the same time. There's no consistency of standards in terms of in Stockton's case, he had been elected by a plurality rather than a majority in the joint session. And other states may have had other standards. And so the problem was that there was, when these cases would come before the Senate, there was no consistency in standards, so it would be hard for the senators to make a determination about the validity of that particular election. And so this 1866 case and the change to the law is the first time that Congress begins to reshape and rethink this Article 1, Section 3 component. It's really about addressing these concerns that are based on the Constitution's sort of vagueness, to be perfectly honest.
Got it. Now, did presidents weigh in at all about who should be the senator, or did they just simply leave that to the states?
Well, there's this, funny you should ask, there's this fascinating case. I mentioned William Lorimer, and while I didn't go into his story because to do so would have taken probably half of my talk, William Lorimer of Illinois is a Republican. And at the time that these allegations of corruption and bribery in his selection become public, largely due to investigative reports published by the Chicago Tribune, Teddy Roosevelt famously refuses to sit on a stage with him. So while Lorimer he survives one of the challenges to his election credentials, but he doesn't survive the second one, meaning that he is unseated in the case of the second investigation. But what's interesting about the case is that yes, these allegations, as widespread as they become, that involve so many different states and so many elections to the U.S. Senate, become an issue of national political import, even to the point where a Republican president is unwilling to be seen in public with one of these people who has been charged with these types of allegations.
Now, when did the practice of a third of the senators being up, each year?
That is built right into the Constitution. So that's part of the Constitution's very important design for the United States Senate as a place where older and wiser members would be removed from the passions of the people by serving longer terms, and those terms would be overlapping. And so every 2 years, only a third of the United States senators, only a third of the seats in the United States Senate are up for election. And so that provides a continuity of expertise, of knowledge, of wisdom, and of understanding about Senate operations, so that even if everyone who was up in every 2-year cycle, even if everyone in that particular class lost their bid for reelection or decided to retire, only the Senate would, 2/3 of the members would remain, and that continuity would continue.
So that was distinct from how the senators were elected.
Yes, absolutely. That was part of the Constitution's original design.
Was there a noticeable change in voter turnout as states began to phase in direct election?
Oh, that's a great question. And I'd have to take a look at the numbers. I don't know off the top of my head. I know that after the ratification of the 19th Amendment, yes, the
Yes.
numbers of women who turned out to vote in those first federal elections definitely increased the vote count those years. Yes.
And so let's talk a little bit about the dynamics of the Senate. One of the questions that as people have raised is the power of the Senate Majority Leader to simply block a bill from coming to the floor. Is there anything in the Constitution that speaks to how the Senate operates on its own rules?
Mm-hmm. Well, the Constitution provides the House and the Senate with a lot of leeway in terms of how they structure their own proceedings. One of them being that I pulled this aside because I thought this might come up. One of them being that the Constitution says that the House and Senate have the ability to examine election disputes, and so that in part is why when there are questions about the Constitution gives each House of Congress the power to be the judge of elections, returns, and qualifications of its own members. And so that is in part why when we get these challenges to senators, challenges because there are claims that the process by which they've been elected is corrupt, it's the Senate who creates their own investigatory committees to examine these allegations. That's part of their right is under the Constitution to do so. In terms of establishing, the Constitution does not provide for party leaders. In fact, the Constitution did not envision parties or describe parties in any way. Although, of course, when you look at the Federalist Papers in defending and promoting the ratification of the Constitution, the framers were very much concerned and focused on the idea of factions and the development of factions, which are early parties, if you will. What the Constitution does is it defines the role of the Speaker of the House. On the Senate side, it defines the role of two officers, the President pro tempore and the Vice President, who serves as the President of the United States Senate. It defines the roles of those people in fairly limited ways. So, meaning they have fairly limited roles. The Vice President of the United States can break tie votes and can sit as the presiding officer of the Senate. And that was those were the two primary jobs of the Vice President well up into the 1950s. If the Senate was in session, you knew where to find the Vice President. They would be seated in the presiding officer's chair. The President pro tempore is the president for a time. They're the person who can stand in for the Vice President when in their absence. But beyond those two defined positions, the Constitution is silent about leadership in the Senate, particularly party leadership. It doesn't envision that. So the evolution of parties and the evolution of Senate leadership is a long process, which I don't have time to go into today, but I would say that it is a process that has evolved from the very earliest days of the United States Senate all the way up until today. And it's a process that's still evolving. To the extent that party leaders today, majority and minority leaders today, have power to shape Senate proceedings, that those are roles that have been further defined and strengthened, in fact, by Senate rules and precedent over time.
We may have to have a follow-up
Second
on
talk,
Senate
yeah,
rules
absolutely.
and precedent and parties, but we just got a couple of quick questions that our folks,
Sure.
someone you mentioned Andrew Johnson, and as vice president, that he favored changing the manner of selecting senators. Was there something in particular that he proposed, and was that during the time he was vice president?
That's a great question. So Andrew Johnson was a proponent of expanding the electorate, if you will, but also he was very much in favor of electoral reform broadly. In fact, while I was reviewing his position for this talk, I was reminded that he favored electoral reform as well of the Electoral College. He actually wanted to abolish the Electoral College and make presidents directly elected by the people, as well as senators directly elected by the people. I believe that Andrew Johnson did submit one of these proposals while he served in the House of Representatives, but I'd have to double check on that. And in his role as vice president, frankly, he was very much consumed by other issues at the time. What I understand is that it was something that he was quite vocal about during his House service, and maybe when he moved into the Senate. But again, during that critical Civil War era, there was so much more. There were so many issues that needed the attention
Lots
of
going
Congress.
on. Lots going on.
A lot to think about.
Now, you raised the issue of the Electoral College, and of course, many people continue to ask. We moved to the direct election of senators. Was there a debate about whether we should move to the direct election of a president at that same time?
Well, I haven't found that the two have been consistently linked over time. What I have found is that there have been moments where people like Andrew Johnson might be calling for general reforms in the electoral process that may include things like changes to the Electoral College or abolishing the Electoral College while also providing for direct election. I have not seen that those things have tracked together in time. And that might be simply a matter of, amending the Constitution is incredibly difficult, right? I'm sure you've found this as you've listened to as you've had invited guests talk about the amendment process. Typically, these roads to amending the Constitution, they're long and winding, as I mentioned today and as I described today. And so what I've found is that typically reformers are focused on something that they find really like they're going to focus on one single issue. They're not going to make some kind of broad case, because that just further complicates their already complicated endeavor.
Well, and it seems as if it's quite clear that amending the Constitution requires bipartisan effort. There is no way that any one party can accomplish that.
That's correct. And in the era of our two-party system, that is absolutely true. Yes.
And we're coming to the end of our time, so let me give you one that we can offer as sort of a wrap. Given the state of today's Senate, in which many of the original problems that confronted the countries continue to confront us, is there, if you could wave your magic wand with your experience as a historian, what kind of amendments would be worthy of discussion?
Well, gosh, I'm all out of magic wands.
Oh, well, I understand
um,
that.
what I would say is this. I mean, to speak to your earlier point here, one of the I take great satisfaction out of studying history because, as you alluded to there in your question, what we find when we study history is that there are few problems that we encounter politically or structurally that have not been encountered by previous generations. And I don't mean to say that. I do take a bit of comfort in that, because what it means is that there there are places in the past that we can look to better understand how we arrived at the position we're in today, and how we might get out of some of the what we might encounter and face some of the challenges that we have today, while also respecting the structures in which we operate. This has been, the story of these efforts to amend the Constitution are really stories about large national reform movements and how they build a coalition for success. And when we look at the 17th Amendment or we look at the 19th Amendment, we're talking about reform movements that last generations, that go on for decades and decades before they achieve the success that they originally hoped for. And so I think that history can provide us with a sense of place. Yes, we may be in troubled times, but look back at the other eras in the past, and show me a time in American history that wasn't troubled, where people didn't encounter
Right.
challenges. It's just, I don't think you'll find one, because as soon as you scratch the surface, even if we want to talk about like the Cold War consensus or something, look, as a Senate historian, I know that you scratch the surface on the Cold War era and you find all kinds of disagreements percolating below that broader assumption about America's place in the world, to just give one example. So I don't think that we should I don't have a magic wand, Jane, and I don't know that I have an amendment proposal to present to you all, but I would say that the best way to face the challenges of today is to read about the past and understand how some of these actors in the past faced the challenges that they encountered. And then also to see, you're going to see the similarities between the challenges that they faced and some of the things that we're talking about today still.
Well, I think that is a very appropriate answer. Because in fact, sometimes people say to me, oh my goodness, how can you do the Capitol Historical Society? There's so much going on. We've never faced such times. And I was like, there was a time where people were caning each other on the Senate floor. There were
Absolutely.
fisticuffs and pistols, and
Mhm.
we had a civil war. We had terrible voter suppression. Women couldn't vote. And, in fact, we are working toward that more perfect union. We don't have a perfect union. And even, the founding documents say toward the more perfect union.
Mhm.
And there's a lot to be learned from the way in which people resolved differences, which were very real, and
Mm,
which continue to this time. So
absolutely.
we are so grateful, Dr. Scott, for your work every day, for the Senate, and to preserve the history, for the time that you've spent with us today. And we are, as always, grateful to our listeners. We thank you for your support, for your engagement. One of the ways that people can support the society is by sharing the invitations to these webinars. We are very, very blessed to have speakers of top quality like Dr. Scott. And each of these webinars is recorded. It will be on our YouTube channel, and so you can share it if you listened and you said, boy, that was really interesting. You can share the recording with your friends and neighbors who may want to know about it. Dr. Scott has also graciously offered to share her contact information if people have particular questions about the history of the Senate that you might want to pursue with her directly. Of course, the Society is always happy to help. We are always looking for ideas from our listeners about what do you want to hear about? What do you want to learn about? What do you want to know about? If you look here at our upcoming events, we're very excited to bring Alan Hantman, who is the 10th architect of the Capitol, to talk about his new book has just come out, Politics, Crisis, and the Architecture of the United States Capitol. Mr. Hantman was the architect of the Capitol during 9/11, oversaw the building of the Capitol Visitor Center, which is a story in and of itself. So he is, it really is worth your time to tune into him. And then we have a different approach. We have a graphic novelist who's decided that we need to remember what happened on January 6th. And one way to remember it is with a graphic novel. So Alan Jenkins, who is a Harvard historian, has written a graphic novel, not something you would normally expect from a Harvard historian. And that will be an interesting one. Just the screen share alone will be entertaining. And then we begin our conversation about the Prohibition Amendments with Garrett Peck. And those of you who are longtime listeners may remember that Mr. Peck shared with us some of the stories about the activities in the Capitol during the Prohibition era. So it will be great fun to have him back with us. We appreciate all of your support, all of your engagement. Thank you for your contributions. We are grateful, Dr. Scott, for you being with us. We are grateful, Vincent Gonzalez, for your behind the scenes work. And we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you. Be well. Goodbye.